Welcome to Adapt It, the podcast where we explore adaptations of various forms. I'm today's host, Tom, and with me is
At
and KJ.
Today we will be introducing Season 3 of this podcast, where we'll be discussing Oscar winners from as early as the 1930s right up into the present decade. And I am very excited to talk about this. I do want to start this podcast by allowing us some space to give some closing thoughts to our season in which we cover detective fiction, noir, expressionism, the Franciscans, the Holy Roman Emperor, Avignon, everything else. So I suppose I'll start with my general thoughts on our last season. And it seems as if the season moved from kind of hope to despair, right? That seemed to be what the second season was. It starts off with this kind of enlightenment meets romance, this sort of like we're going to solve everything, and we have this really exciting and modern hero that's going to fix the problems of the world, and it ends with the greatest storehouse of knowledge being destroyed and that figure of the detective dying of plague without having solved the crime for which he is famous for investigating. And it's an interesting movement into something kind of sad and depressing. At least I found it to be so. Not depressing in the sense of, I was sad to do it or sad to read these materials, but in the sense of the hopeful aspirations that begin with Holmes, and we could even say with Dupin, that we covered at the beginning of the season, seems to not have been realized by the end. And we have to almost leave the modern world behind and go into this kind of pre-modern world in order to really see the problems of the modern world, which is what Eco does for us, Umberto Eco does for us in The Name of the Rose, at least as I read it. And of course, the big turn in the season was that expressionism and noir episodes that we covered, in which we have a sort of move from optimism to, I guess you would call it, tragic existentialism. And it seems to end, though, in this kind of ironic dismissal of the hope of knowledge, in which knowledge itself is just burnt to the ground and uselessly so. And that's my reading of the second season.
So this maybe this explains KJ's love for this season. As we were saying, it's not so much. It wasn't so much closing words on the season. I think for KJ, this is getting closure on the season.
I can't believe we're still talking about it. No, here's what happened in season 2. Here's what happened. Every step of the way, I was a step behind and tried to apply the previous week's logic to the next week. Don't worry, Sherlock Holmes isn't going to solve anything. He's going on an adventure. Oh, okay. What's Poirot doing? Oh, no, Poirot you can solve. Oh, okay. Next week, I'll solve what's the Ray Chandler one? I forget exactly which one it was.
It was German existentialism. German existentialism.
Try and solve that. The genre evolved. It evolved.
I think Tom's commentary is probably pretty accurate. I mean, I think there's this sense, and it this is why I think it's an interesting genre. It's a very modern genre. The particular genre doesn't really exist prior to really mid-19th century. So it has a very Enlightenment feel. Again, I agree. It's a very Enlightenment meets Romanticism. It has sort of a 19th century optimism to it. There is very much the 19th century very much has this idea. We'll probably get into this a little later in the podcast when we talk about sort of the long 19th century. But there's this idea that like we can figure it out, we can solve it, we can find out how people tick, we can find out how society ticks, and all we need to do is figure those things out and then just patch up the holes, and then all problems will be solved. I mean, this is the era of pure utopianism, and not like ironic utopianism, actual utopianism. So I think that's really a 19th century thing, and that's where Holmes comes in. Holmes and Poirot, to a large extent, are sort of still in that genre. They think that if you just put all the pieces in a row and you put your elbow grease in, you'll solve the problems, and if you can solve the problems, you can save the world. There's and reset it back to normal. Whereas I think, and again, we'll probably get to this later on, is, I think the short 20th century is about the opposite. That there's sort of this realization that you cannot do that. You won't do that. And there's sort of this despair, this despair starts to leak into it. And yeah, by the end of it, by the end of the 20th century, there's almost this just sense of, well, it doesn't even if it doesn't even matter where it's not even bleak. It's not so much that it's saying, well, you can't solve anything, and the other side is saying, well, you can solve all the world. There's at the end of the 20th century, it's almost just like doesn't even matter. You can't even talk about it. Like there's just this total collapse of any sort of notion of it. Now, you can still people still watch them. They're still popular. Things like SVU still have them, and this kind of stuff. But it's still a popular genre. But I think sort of the cutting edge nature of the genre, even going to something like Girl with a Dragon Tattoo, that's just like society is just messed up, and even if you solve it, there's still major problems, and just people are awful, and there's just a real despair by the time you get to the end of this period.
The other side of the coin that we didn't really bring up last season is you also have Columbo, Monk, Murder She Wrote,
Yeah,
right? You also have the happy
Mhm.
version of all
I'm not
of
saying they're
this.
not there, but I think they're throwbacks. They're quaint. They're sort of,
Mm.
it's
Hmm.
like there still are laugh track sitcoms. Big Bang Theory was wildly popular. You could have essentially toned it down a little bit and moved that next to Jackie Gleason, and you could have had the same sort of general formula. It's not to say that the formula doesn't work. It's just to say, and it's not to say the formula isn't popular. It's just that is an older formula being sort of just refitted to the modern period, and that's fine. You can still watch it, people can still be entertained by it. But as sort of it definitely evolves in a new direction, and sort of its cutting edgeness is really represented by things like Girl with the Dragon Tattoo. And that is just brutal violence, horrible things, no real resolution.
Yeah, Diagnosis Murder wasn't necessarily cutting edge.
Yeah, I mean, I love, I mean, I still watch, some of these old, some of the really old ones, and they feel like, yeah, they're a little dated, but you can pretty much take them and put them on the stage today, and I don't think people would on the television screen today, and I don't think people would be that upset.
But I think to your point, there is a sort of quaintness to it that comes off as fun or maybe even unrealistic. I
It's
over the
fantasy. It's fantasy. Yeah,
Yeah.
they're now fantasy
Right,
things, which
right.
is which is fine,
Yep.
but they're fantasy.
Yeah, I over the weekend watched Murder She Wrote, which is a show I have not watched since I was a child with my grandmother. And I watched the first episode, which is actually called The Murder of Sherlock Holmes, which is a costume party in which the person dressed up as Sherlock Holmes gets murdered. And it is just like a Poirot or Miss Marple. I mean, she's not that different from Miss Marple, except she's an American and she's an author. And so, as you're saying that, I think that they are throwbacks and they're comfort food, right? Which is what this sort of popular audience might be looking for. Though, as you also have said in previous episodes, Pat, the contemporary SVUs are much darker than this. They're sort of the cutting edge is sort of bleeding into the popular, and now it's much more bleak. I think another good representation, we didn't do it because it's not an adaptation, is the movie Seven, in which it's a murder mystery. It's incredibly brutal, and in the end, you get no resolution, and nothing even seems to make sense. You don't even get the killer's name. You never figure out who he is or what's going on. The movie is entirely set in rain until the last scene, which is set in bright sunlight. Um,
So we can
we
see what's in the box.
so we could see what's in the box, right? I don't like Seven. I shouldn't say this is. I'm not singing Seven's praises, but I do think the fact
I
that
kind
that
of like
movie,
Seven, but
yeah, well, I find it to be kind of intensely gross. But I do think it's a good exemplar of what detective fiction became. And that movie was wildly successful. It had big actors in it, it made a ton of money. And for some reason, people were drawn to this really intense and really disturbing material. And it's not just the intensity of the violence that's going on, it's the lack of resolution, right? The wrong people are even dead at the end, right? Like the wife is one of the, I mean, you have seven bodies, but one of them is the wife who presumably didn't commit a sin. You have all these notes from John Doe, which you think are going to give you some insight, but they're just sort of random notes. We never get his name, as I said before. And so I think, like you're saying, the cutting edge is now bleeding into the popular, and it's it's not a hopeful hopeful popular thing that's going on. It's
There's no
pretty
sense they
dark.
don't return to normalcy.
Yeah.
Normalcy. All of the Sherlock Holmeses and all of the Poirots and these things. There's something that upsets normalcy. There's the detective is the sort of superhero who comes in, resets everything, and we return to essentially normalcy. That's generally it's a fundamentally conservative genre. I don't think that's true of modern. I think there is a return, but whatever you return to, if it is normal, the normal isn't good. Or if what you return to is the new normal is also not good. There's no sense that what you have returned to is a positive resolution. It's sort of just a sense that this will just continue. And I think there's a Sisyphusian quality to it.
Yeah, which is the girl with the dragon tattoo, right? The girl with the dragon tattoo is we've returned to normal, and normal is horrible.
Yeah. And again, there is that sort of Sisyphusian quality of, and this is more the existentialist, but we're just going to keep doing it. Those are the more positive ones are, but you know what, just get back out there. This is what it is to be a person. We just got to fight for the good. That's the more positive ones. But I think there's some that are more like Seven, which is just like, what was the point? There was no point, and the world is worse. So you could there's a lot we could say about it, but I think it's not the detective genre becomes less sunny.
There's an episode of Black Mirror where they're trying to solve a crime. Have you guys ever seen Black Mirror? You guys ever watch?
No, I've never seen it.
I have, and I stopped because it was Black Mirror. I think the best description of Black Mirror was it's Twilight Zone that's angry at its audience. That's
Yeah, it makes you feel really bad usually.
yeah.
But well, audience, there's an episode. I don't remember which one it is. It's got artificial bees in it, but go check it out if you want a cutting edge detective story. I think it's appropriate for this conversation.
That was an X-Files episode, wasn't it? They were trying to spread the black virus with bees, wasn't it?
Well,
were they?
This one it involves AI bees that can make hives that are 3D printers that can make bees, and it also involves social media. Gets all wrapped up into this detective story, so I think it's a very.
Were there self-driving cars? Because then and the cloud, because then we've just got all 20th century
everything.
technology,
That's what I'm
21st
saying.
century
It's
technology
cutting
all rolled
edge.
into it.
It's
yeah.
all in
yeah.
there.
You could have the cloud and self-driving cars, and then and the blockchain. Then we're good.
Yep, Bitcoin.
Yeah.
I think I saw this episode and I don't remember it. I remember something with bees. Maybe I turned it off, but I don't remember a mystery. I do remember artificial bees, but regardless. Yeah. And it's Echo's work is an interesting thing because it almost seems like Echo is returning to the point in time when things went wrong. Right? I feel like that's once that library gets burnt down, once we no longer have a unified world.
I blame Occam for all of this, man.
Yes.
We've talked about this on separate things, but I still blame Occam for all this. We're not going to get into no. We're not going to get into Occam now. But I blame Occam for it all. But that's a conversation for another day.
That's Ideas Have Consequences, the Richard Weaver book, which is he blames William of Occam for the modern world
for all of our modern problems.
And so that's a
and
really
I'm not
good...
joking. I know it sounds. I'm not joking. I blame William of Occam.
Yeah, and Pout is actually working within a tradition. Audience, check out the 1940s book Ideas Have Consequences, in which the examination of William of Occam as at fault for modern society's lack or loss of telos is extrapolated. But there we go.
This might be a topic. I feel like this is a topic that might fit into our next season. So maybe we can discuss William of Occam. Mm-hmm. I can go on my William of Occam.
You want to go on your William of Occam
on the next season? I will find an opportunity to go on my William of Occam rant.
Yeah. I always well, anyway, I'm not going to go there, but regardless, I do think that was why that's a brilliance of Echo's book that we didn't cover last episode, which is William of Occam is sort of the beginning of the problem, right? I think that's Echo goes back to that point in time when things went wrong, and we kind of followed it out through last episode.
Which brings us to our season 3, where we're going to be exploring adaptations that won the Academy Award for Best Picture. And we're going to be exploring decade by decade why that movie may have been the one that rose to the top, or how it represents that decade, or what was going on at that time that this is the movie.
How it reflects the priorities of that time.
Well said. There it is.
There we go. And so that's what we're talking about. We didn't have a particular reading for this week, though Pat had read and recommended is a strong word for how you describe this
I
book,
recommended the earlier books in the volume, not the fourth volume. I think the fourth volume is trash and I couldn't finish it, but the first one's really good, and then they kind of go downhill, and the fourth one's unreadable.
Well, there is an idea that
What are we reading here so the audience isn't?
Yeah.
I should introduce it. So the book is The Age of Extremes, The History of the World, 1914 to 1991 by Eric Hobsbawm. And he's a Marxist historian. He has covered, I think, from the French Revolution up to 1914 in past editions. This one is really concerned with the First World War and onward, but really looking at it in terms of the East-West divide, Soviet-US divide as it grew and expanded, and then eventually the dissolving of the Soviet states, etc. And he has this idea, and Pat, I'll let you talk about this since you know it better than I do, which is the short 20th century. There's a long 19th century. There is a very long 18th century, but there is only a short 20th century. And that short 20th century is going to be I would call it a backbone for this season. We're going to kind of use that to help us along. And Pat, would you like to share some insights into what that is?
Yeah, so I'll just kind of quickly at least discuss like what the idea of the long 19th century. So the long 19th century isn't really Hobsbawm's idea. The long 19th century is sort of an idea that beginning with the French Revolution in 1789 through essentially 1914 and World War I. So this is why it's the long 19th century. You're getting a little bit of the 18th century and a little bit of the 20th century. So it's like about 130 years. And so that essentially the same ideas are being explored throughout this entire period, and beginning from 1789 through about 1914. And as we were talking about earlier in the podcast, it is a fundamentally optimistic project. There is an idea here, especially in the 19th century, that we can fix things, we can fix everything, we can define it, we can solve it, we can find out how the world works, and if we know how the world works, we can tweak it in order to make it better. That's sort of the fundamental idea, and that's why you get a lot of this in the 19th century. You get a lot of people trying to come up with systems to explain not only how things work but why they work, and then how they're going to be improved in the future. And this can range from things like Darwin, essentially explaining fundamentals of how do species come about, how do they improve themselves, and then people take that and they kind of run with that. Oh, okay, well, how can we improve the rest of society? And again, some of these ideas are going to come up later in the 20th century, and they're going to be horrific. But the idea
it
is
makes
that
sense at that point, right? The train that changed
Absolutely.
everything. Like you could get around.
Yeah.
Plumbing, even just like being able to move a cannon around on a little motor. Like it
Oh, I'm not saying this is wrong. I mean, they're seeing,
right?
and this
Why
is
wouldn't
they're
you think they're
seeing that
improving society
suddenly
everywhere?
Yeah, you've gone from a society that is barely subsistence, and there is, and I should say that this is something we kind of still forget nowadays, is that even when we look back at, say, the 16th century and Shakespeare, and there's great art and things like that, the vast majority of people are still living at essentially subsistence levels. We don't tend to see them, we don't tend to talk about them because they're not that interesting, or it's not even that they're not that interesting, it's that we don't have any information about them. You go back to, say, the Roman Empire. Most of what we're reading is a fairly small subset. And even the people we do have information that aren't writing it, most of them tend to be people that were living in cities. That's representing maybe 10, maybe 15% of the population. Most people were living subsistence lives out in the countryside, and we don't tend to get a lot of information about them because people didn't write about them. They didn't care about them. So if you do get in the 19th century, this is a time period when mass movements are coming about, mass production is coming about. You are seeing, as much as people, and there are horrific sides to industrialization, but as much as there is, this is always one of the things I always think is, Marx was not anti-industrialist. He was pro-industrialism. He thought industrialism was absolutely fundamental to communism. You have to have industrialization because that's where you get mass production. That there were leaps and bounds in terms of sort of human quality of human life, just in terms of what they were able to do. Doesn't mean it doesn't come with negative consequences. That's what the rest of this is going. But there is this idea that we are now producing vastly more food. We can travel the world in vastly faster amount of times. Hobsbawm goes on to like a fairly lengthy thing discussing, just even communications. You could essentially get a communication once you had telegraph lines from, say, London to Australia in an hour, two. That was impossible. Like all this stuff. I mean, that's futuristic. At this time. So there's the 19th century is a very optimistic time, and that just comes, and there's still this idea, like Freud is a huge part of that, like this idea that we will explain how the mind works. We've broken it down. We just need to figure out how to solve these pieces. Like it's a very optimistic, positive time, and I think that comes absolutely crashing down in 1914 because of World War One. And that's where people start to see, like, oh wait, it is not it's not a positive thing necessarily. It's horrific. And there's this idea that sort of comes out of it that all of those things that we thought were good can be turned to extremely negative uses. And so that sort of begins to occur throughout the, more or less the 20th century, this sort of dawning realization. And so that's the idea of the long 19th century. The idea of the short 20th century is more, I think Hobsbawm isn't the first to discuss it, but he's sort of the first to really, I think, popularize it and make it more of a kind of common term. Is basically beginning in usually either 1914 or 1918, maybe 1917, up through basically 1990. And this idea of essentially beginning with World War One or the Russian Revolution through the fall of the Soviet Union. And this idea that the world fundamentally changes. I'm, not usually a big fan of historical time periods, of just like cutting off points, sort of being like, well, the Middle Ages ended in 1453 with the fall of Constantinople. Like, yeah, it really doesn't work. A lot of these time periods, even the fall of Rome is when, the Visigoths sack Rome, sort of these things like, it doesn't really work either. Most of these don't work. I think one of the few ones you really strongly can call are probably 1789. That's just, things are very, very different in a fundamentally different way in 1914. Those are just fundamentally different time periods. They're just like demarcation points where things are just radically different, and they will never go back. So this idea of going in the short 20th century, from going from, say, about 1914 through about 1990, it also conveniently for us overlaps pretty much with the mass popularization of film and mass media in general. And I think this idea of, hey, let's look at different films from these periods. And some of these are movies that are not, I think we're gonna talk about Mrs. Miniver. People don't watch Mrs. Miniver nowadays. Like, you're not really gonna see many people watching that. But some of these films, and looking at these movies and saying, like, okay, let's look at movies that were popular, because it's not even necessarily popular, but they were considered to be the best of a particular time period. And why were they so important during that time period, and sort of what is going on in the short 20th century, and using these films as a backdrop to discuss that.
Very nice. Yes, I'm excited for this. Um, I've been doing some reading as well, trying to see what my guesses are as to what we're going to find, sort of hypotheses as to what's going to transpire and what have you. And sort of looking at trends in Oscar winners and other associated awards. And there was an interesting study by Miguel Sarajevo, and he had kind of looked at Oscar winners from the first Oscars in 1929 up until, I believe, he ends in 2022. and looking at the associations. If you won Best Picture, what other Oscars did you win? And what is the trend? And typically, what we see overall is that initially, Best Director and Best Picture didn't go together, and then they did. And everyone who won Best Picture won Best Director. And then very often technical accomplishments, editing, the various special effects awards, which change name over time, they sort of go along very often with the Best Picture winner. What ends up happening is in later years, you start to see again a return to a divorce between Best Picture and Best Director, and also a divorce between Best Picture and the kind of visual effect awards and the technical awards. And you start to see more of Best Pictures winning, winning as well the Best Screenplay awards. And so it seems like the course of the Oscars, what ends up being celebrated is a movement from technical achievement and the celebration of the director as the kind of choreographic figure, the person who holds together this giant technical thing, and even a movement away from the producer. We used to award a Thalsberg Award at the Oscars to the best producer, and that kind of has stopped. We don't do that very frequently, or the Oscars don't do that very frequently. To
They
now,
raise money better than anyone else raised money.
well, I mean, a producer is a person who
I
gets it all together. I mean, yeah, they raise money, but they're the spectacle person, right? They're the, P.T. Barnum figure. And that seems to have gone away in favor of screenplays and scripts and storytelling. That seems to again has emerged as what is considered quote unquote good or excellent or artistically fulfilling, as opposed to spectacle, which seemed to be more the fulfilling thing in earlier decades. And so I think what we're going to see is that movement. And the other thing too is looking at box office receipts and seeing what percentage of tickets the Best Picture award winners got. And they're usually up there in the top 3 or 4. How Green Was My Valley is a unique year because of the controversy with Citizen Kane, but mostly you're seeing until like the 1950s a top 2, top 3, even top 4 Best Picture winner in terms of box office receipts, and that is wildly not the case anymore. They're not even close.
Argo was popular.
Argo made
Oppenheimer, I think, was
something
very yeah.
like
Argo was
Oppen
probably and Oppenheimer made money.
Oppenheimer made just under $1 billion
Yeah,
compared to Barbie, which I think made $1.4 billion. So
but
that was it.
you're talking significant winners.
Mhm. Yeah, there's a huge difference. But if you look at Argo, Argo made maybe 10% of the box office receipt that the top film made.
Oh, I thought it did better than that, but
Like 10 or
you certainly could be
15%.
right.
Yeah, it's around there. Most it's 20%. That was not the case. Even something like Mrs. Miniver, it wasn't the top movie of its year, but it made like 98% of the money that the top movie made. It was pretty close. Gone with the Wind was never the top movie in any year, but it was in the top 5 for 3 years, so it made more money than anybody. But that's also another trend. And my hypothesis going into this is, and I don't know the history yet of it, but my hypothesis is a sort of pseudo Marshall McLuhan look, which is as the media age advances, what you're creating then is what he would call a global village. We all can look at the same thing. What McLuhan seems to have gotten wrong is my hypothesis is that once you create globalness, you create global localities, and that we no longer use the cinema as the touchstone for excellence equaling popularity. They go together. It's what the common person thinks is excellent wins the Oscar, but that we're moving into these kind of localities. And as a consequence of that, fewer people are seeing the quote unquote best movie. I think Oppenheimer is an exception and an interesting one, but fewer people are seeing the quote unquote best movie. More people are seeing a box office hit, which is always seems to be a different movie. But what is considered excellent is now broken up into these global localities. We don't share a notion of excellence anymore. And that seems to be the sort of history of the 20th century, which I don't, you could see as pessimistic. I kind of see it as optimistic. I'm perfectly fine with a sort of fracturing of what we as a people see as excellent, but there's also some problems with that, right? There's a sort of loss of social purpose that potentially could go along with that. And so those are some of the ideas I'm bringing forward into this season. I don't know if we can prove them, disprove them, if they're radically false or what have you, but that's what I'm thinking I'm going to stumble upon as we go week to week.
Do you guys watch the Academy Awards?
I used to, and
I
then they
used to.
got to be 4.5 hours long, and I have children, and I don't.
I watched them this year, and they did shorten them up. They were very conscientious of
The
that
worst
problem.
was when they shortened them up, though, by getting rid of the technical awards. That just irritated. They were like,
Yeah.
okay, we're gonna make it shorter by not giving, like, not showing you who won Best Sound. I'm like, come on, give those guys some time.
But that kind of shows you the sort of priorities, right? Which is like, we don't see technical excellence as excellence anymore, right? That's a thing for like
Well, it's a
Avengers
given.
movies.
It's a given. If you don't have technical excellence, you're
Mhm.
you're dead in the water. That's just a given now.
Yeah.
So do you guys watch the movies that are nominated? Or maybe I'll say, do you make an effort at all? Is that
No, I think
I've
I said the
stopped.
last Best Picture movie I saw was Argo. I think to Tom's point, I think something different is going on. But the last one I think I saw was Argo. I mean, again, I don't tend to see a lot of modern movies, but the last one I saw was Argo.
do we think in the last so audience we're middle aged, do we think in the last 20 years the movies were a good representation, or uh, we're marching in saying, hey, we're picking these movies because maybe they're going to say something about that decade or that year? Do we think that's true, at least in our lifetime, that we've lived through and then seen what bubbled up to the top?
I do not think they do anymore. That was going to be my general theory, is that no, I don't think the Academy Awards do represent that anymore. And I will be curious to see how that works out. But I think they are in a bubble lately. And I think there are exceptions, to that. And I think they're sort of fighting back against that. But I think just, I mean, I remember talking to somebody about, the Academy Awards recently, and it was like some work, someone coworker. And I think it was when, what was it, Sound of Water? What was the one that won one year?
The Shape of Water.
Shape of Water. And I just heard him being like, it's about some dude who bangs a fish. Why is this winning the movie? And he was just like, this is terrible. Like, what is up with this thing? It's terrible. I'm not gonna watch this. Why would I ever watch this thing? He's not a dumb person. And it was just like, why would I watch this? Like, they don't want to see this. Like, there was like it's unusual to just have like an active aversion to this thing and be like, the very premise of this movie just sounds dumb. And I'm not saying that it was. I haven't seen it. I don't know. It could be a beautiful movie. But the point is, like, that is not reflecting your average, generally popular thing. I think a lot of movies have it, and there are exceptions, obviously. Lord of the Rings wins. That's a wildly popular movie. It remains wildly popular.
And
There
it
are some
was
really
the
good,
box office leader that year.
yeah, and it should have been, and it should have won, and it's amongst the best movies of all time. It's going to age really well. But I don't know if right now, I guarantee you there are many, many people at this moment watching Lord of the Rings. It is wildly popular. If you flip through the channels and I see it, people will stop and watch. They want to see certain scenes from it. They know it really well. It's sort of entered I don't like this term, but it's entered the zeitgeist. Like, it's there. We all have it. But something like Shape of Water, there's no way. Like, if there are 5 people in the entire world watching that movie right now, I will be shocked. Like, there's just people aren't watching these on repeats. They're just not.
Hmm.
And so that to me reflects like, that's the best you made that year. That is the best thing you made that year. And that strikes me as, well, then what does that say? I think there is something going on. Like, the fact that you could go back to the 50s and 60s, and there's many popular movies. You find them in Turner Classic Movies, this kind of stuff, and they'll be around for a long time. I don't know if people in 50 years, if people are going to be popping in Shape of Water. I just don't think they are. And those are the kind of things I think something weird happened, and it just there was a fundamental fracture. And I don't know, maybe Oppenheimer is the return to that. But I remember when Argo won, that was, I had seen the movie that year, I remember thinking like, yeah, it's a good movie. It was fun. I don't think it was, again, I don't think it was the best movie of that year. But I remember when it won, people were saying this is the Oscars trying to return to normality. This is them trying to be like, nope, we're going to start respecting what people like, not what the Academy likes, or what, something like that. So, I don't think that was the case. I think there were still some good movies. Like I still want to see the is it the 10 Years a Slave, 12 Years a Slave? I still want to see
12
that. I've
Years a
heard, yeah,
Slave.
12 Years a Slave I've heard is really, really good. So I would like to see that one. Like there's other ones, but some of the ones in recent years, you know, there are problems with them. I just think, but I don't actually know if we're watching any of them. I think I didn't pick those ones.
Well,
But
KJ,
the
you do watch all the Oscars every year, Oscar nominees and winners.
Yeah, well, my wife and I, Rachel, we try. So we usually get through all the Best Picture nominees, and I'd say we usually get through, 25, 35 films during that season. And we love it. It's just fun because, in our non-monoculture society we live in, this is kind of like one of the closest things you get is the Academy Award night. I mean, the Super Bowl, sure, but at least you have one night where everybody can kind of look at a TV at the same time. Um, Honestly, the award show, it's a lot of fun to watch with Rachel, and I do enjoy staying up that night and eating snacks and stuff. But I'm not. That doesn't really matter who wins or loses. It's more just fun that the nation's celebrating movies.
it's a fun for a celebration of film.
Hmm.
Yes.
But what do you think, AJ, in terms of recent years, over the last, let's say, 10 or 20 years? Do you find these movies to exemplify something, or are they really touching on what people are saying or talking about? In the sense of like everybody was watching Lord of the Rings in 2002, 2003 when it won. That was the most popular movie of that year. And there's Coda, which wasn't even screening in theaters. I think it screened in 3 countries, none of which was America, right? I mean, you had to have Apple Plus and won Best Picture, which is no comment on the movie itself, but that is a really interesting transformation in 20 years. So, what was your take on all of that time?
I don't know if I have a grand take here, but yeah, in the very recent years that we have all these streamers, right, we're losing the monoculture. So the list of movies is usually a little strange, which is kind of nice, right? You get a variety of
Hmm.
different movies if you're going to go seek them. It's also been interesting, like you said, they're not necessarily in theaters. So because they're on a bunch of streamers, you generally have more access to them than you may have done, in 2010 or 2011. And the theater usually will play them anyway, even if it's not the time that they're supposed to be in theaters, or if they can get their hands on it, they usually will now play them leading up. Right, the theaters are so desperate to get anybody in a seat, they'll play these movies. I don't I'm looking at a list now, and I don't know that any of them represent what was going on that year. But I'm wondering too, when you're in the forest, it's hard to see, or if you're looking at the trees, it's hard to see the forest. Um, and if the Academy has changed, right? What started the Academy Awards?
Oh, it was Louis Mayer was trying to create sort of kind of a publicity stunt to,
It's like the All-Star game. Yeah.
yeah, to kind of award movies and draw attention to them, that type of thing.
So if that's how it started, did it stay that way throughout the entire short 20th century, or maybe this is something we're going to explore?
It still is to some extent because I remember there was a when I was at Holy Cross, there was a professor who wrote a thing discussing the change from five, from when they went from 5 Academy Awards to 10, and basically saying like there is any movie that gets nominated tends to see a fairly significant bump in its in its receipts if it's still out there, or if it's on DVD, it tends to see a significant sales bump. And the question was, well, what happens when it goes to 10? Does that is it proportional? Does it get diminished? Like what happens to it? I have no idea what actually he found from it. But the point is there was definitely a study of like these things still have the effect that, I mean, and it certainly does. We would not be talking, we if Shape of Water did not win an Academy Award, I would never have heard of it, and I guarantee you it would not be on most people's lips nowadays. And I keep using that one as an example, but there's plenty of others. Coda, a lot of these movies we wouldn't know about them. Some of them certainly would. Lord of the Rings, regardless of whether it wins an Academy Award, would still be where it is. Like that was more a recognition of what it was, rather than an elevation to say like this is something that should be upheld. It was a recognition of, and that actually could be that might be partially what we're going to find. I wonder, now that I'm talking about it, is it going to be that previously there was sort of this acknowledgement that like this is something great and we are just acknowledging its greatness, whereas I think at certain periods of the Academy Awards it's less that and more a, hey, this thing over here that no one saw, we should pull this out of the corner and raise it up so that it gets attention.
Yeah, I read one study looking at this, and it was trying to compare the sort of that sort of atmosphere, what we might call like a political atmosphere, trying to manipulate the awards to get more attention to certain things. And apparently, the guild itself, the Academy Awards, are fairly resistant
Yeah,
to
I
that.
like guild. I love calling it a guild. Great.
Well, it
I mean,
is,
it
yeah.
it is, but it's a great. Yeah.
That's interesting because Parasite, they said they spent over 20K campaigning to get on the to
Mhm.
get nominated.
Yeah, I think you have to probably campaign to get people to acknowledge it, but I think there is a an idea because it's a fairly limited thing. There's only about 10,000 members of the Oscars or the Academy Awards, but I don't think there's this like the person who pays the most gets the nomination or gets the
Got it.
award,
Got it.
right? I think there is, yeah, you need to pay some money so people know your movie, right? I mean, Parasite's an unusual one because it's a movie in a foreign language, and so you can imagine people tend to avoid those. They don't like to read their movies, and so you probably just need to get attention to it. But once you get attention on it, there is this presumption of we are evaluating excellence. And what that means, I think, changes decade to decade or year to year, or whatever time segment you want to do. But I don't think it's necessarily that most, the movie that campaigns the most wins, right? I think there is still some sort of resistance to that. And I think this thing we call the Oscars is still a barometer that measures something more than how much money did we spend to campaign for an Oscar. I think it is showing us something.
Something I just wanted to mention because I think, and again, I think this is something that will be an interesting thing to look at, is when we proposed this idea for next season, I thought, okay, I'm going to go make a big spreadsheet and I'll go through every Best Picture winner and I'll note which ones are adaptations from something. And my assumption was like, and I thought, well, we'll see if this has any legs to stand on. I know there's a decent number of ones out there, and I could just skim them and be like, well, obviously, All Quiet on the Western Front is based on the book. So I could skim them and see which ones were based on things. But I thought, all right, let me just see how many there are. It shocked me how many, especially early on, are adapted from something. Almost everything early on. It's like the very first winner, Wings, was not, and then pretty much you have to go all the way up to Going My Way in 1945 before you hit another one. There's a few in there like you could kind of debate. Like I think there's like one based like The Great Ziegfeld is based on Ziegfeld's Follies, which isn't really like a plot or something, but they still were taking material, plopping it in there. It wasn't just written for the screen. They were taking things that existed in the world and putting them out there. So many of them, and then you get like Going My Way, and then it's like another 8 or 9 years before you get another one, and then almost there's like maybe six, I think I counted, up until you get to Rocky. Rocky is written for the screen, and then you get a bunch there. And then even in the 80s, you get a huge number of them are all adaptations of either a play, or mostly a play, a short story, or a novel. In the 90s, same thing. Like you get a few in there, like Unforgiven is original, or something like Braveheart is original, Titanic is original. So you do start getting more and more of them, but there's still a lot of them in there, still English Patient. It's not really until you get to about the 2010s, meaning the last 15 years or so, that almost every one of them is original, that they're not adaptations. So since about 2008, I think pretty much since No Country for Old Men, there's only a handful that are adaptations. Something like 12 Years a Slave is based on the book from the 19th century, 12 Years a Slave. That was an adaptation. But again, some of them are like, okay, Argo's kind of based in adaptation. It's based on a true story, and they kind of took it from some stories, but it's not really. There's a handful in there that are taken. There's another one, the one with Francis McDonald, I think it was.
No,
Nomadland.
man.
Yeah, Nomadland. That was based on a nonfiction one. So there are a handful in there, but it's really only been in the last 15 or 20 years that the majority or more of I can't. Can you have majority or more? More than one. It's
A
probably nonsensical.
plurality or more?
No, I mean it is a majority, but it's
Mm,
it's it's a majority, and but maybe 75%, 80% of them
great majority.
are not adapted. So there's something really interesting that there's almost this idea, especially early on, that a great movie, almost exclusively the Best Picture winners are adaptations. There's something weird there. I just think that's a really weird phenomenon, and it's only been in about the last 15 or 20 years that there's this sense that like, no, 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 we can write our own things for the screen, directly for the screen, and most of those are winning. I don't know if that more reflects that just books and plays and short stories aren't as popular. I don't know exactly what it reflects, but something weird happens in the last 15 or 20 years, and I think that'll be an interesting thing to look at. Like, why was it so many of them were adaptations early on?
Yeah, so I have some sort of insight or some sort of hypothesis related to this. And if you look at, movies between like the 1970s, 1980s, 1990s, you see a lot of them that win Best Picture also tend to win technical awards. They tend to still be sort of spectacles. And that's also true of the 1950s and 1960s. You get like a lot more of that until Midnight Cowboy in 1969, which isn't an adaptation, but that doesn't win. I think don't think wins any technical awards. I think it only wins 3 Oscars, including Best Picture. But then there's a steep decline. In the 90s, the average Best Picture winner wins 6.6 awards, many of them technical. It moves down to 5.9 in the 2000s and then 3.5 in the 2010s. And as you have fewer awards associated with the Best Picture, more likely you're going to get Best Screenplay. So it seems to be a movement away from, and I said this earlier in the episode, for some reason, once we start to write original stuff, um, the we tend to move away from appreciating spectacle to appreciating story. And even we start to see the end of directors sort of being nominated just because their film was nominated, right? I mean, between 1957 and 1997, of all of the Best Picture winners, only 4 of them did not have a Best Director winner associated with that. Since then, 6 in the last 10 years have not won Best Director. So there's this movement away from director to story or spectacle to story that somehow is associating technical excellence with directing and what people think of as good in the last 10, 20 years as being original story. And I think
Does
to
that
your
help
point,
to explain, say, something like Avatar? Take Avatar. Like that was a shock when Avatar lost. Does it lose for that reason that people
I think
there's
so.
almost an anti-spectacle? People love it. They were willing to give it all the technical awards, and even I think Avatar won Best Director because I think it beat
No,
uh,
Catherine Bigelow won Best Director because
oh, did she win Best Director
she beat
too?
her ex-husband.
I didn't
Yeah.
realize she also won Best Director. I was
Mm,
thinking okay, so then she won that and she won Best Picture. Because
I
actually,
think
I
so.
kind of remember that because I
Mm,
remember talking at the time. Like I have a memory, and you're right because I remember being everyone being like, "Oh, well, they gave her Best Director because clearly they're gonna give Avatar Best Picture." So they were splitting the two. That's right. I do remember that. But I
yeah.
guess I do wonder if that was a rejection of spectacle that they're willing to give it all the technical awards, they're willing to give it all this stuff and recognize, again, I don't like Avatar, but recognize it as a great film, a very popular film. But there was sort of this idea of like, but we're not recognizing that as Best Picture anymore. We're gonna give it to Hurt Locker. Like
Yeah.
I feel like is part of that movement away from spectacle.
But there's also a problem, and the Oscars acknowledged this in 2018 when they suggested that there's going to be a Best Picture winner and also a Best Most Popular Picture winner.
Oh, I remember that.
That was in 2008.
I do remember
Yes.
that.
They were
Oh
going
my
to be
God.
like,
Most popular movie and Best Picture. I totally forgot
Did
about
somebody
that.
win most popular?
I don't know if they ever carried through with it. I'd
No,
have
they
to look
totally.
that
I
up, but
remember that
there
though.
was just this, because there was this problem of like,
I
okay,
think it was after La La Land lost because it was like La La Land was at least like I've seen that one. That was a popular movie, and it was
Moonlight,
Moonlight
it was
one.
Moonstruck.
Moonlight, but it was like, but I remember,
Cher's return to the Oscar
but she
stage.
won, didn't she win Best
Moonstruck
Actress for
was
that?
nominated.
Moonstruck
It
was, and I
was.
think
Cher
did she
won
win Best
Oscar for
Actress?
it.
She won the
Yeah, she
actress
did.
for it.
Mhm.
Yeah, so you can't blame me for bringing it back. But anyway,
I don't.
Moonlight. But so Moonlight. But
Mhm,
when that one won, that was a shock.
mhm.
That one, and I know it was the weird thing with the envelope aside. That was just sort of funny. But that was a shock. I think people thought La La Land was going to win, and I think that was kind of the beginning of this. Like, you know, there are movies that are popular and they're just not winning. Um, and I
Yeah,
think there was a little bit of a movement to have that most popular Oscar. I do remember that discussion.
yeah. And
It sounded like an Onion article, honestly, but I do remember seeing it.
yeah, and
That
Moonlight
really
just
does. That's a great Onion article, by the way. That's like a great Oscars agree to have most popular award alongside Best Picture.
and it's Moonlight is one of the lowest revenues Best Picture winner ever had. I found a list of 90 of them by box office, and it was 70. Moonlight was 79 on the list. I think it made 2017. It made like $81 million, which compared to the Avengers, I think the Avengers, which came out in 2012, made like $1.5 billion or something like that. And whatever the most popular movie of that year was, I think it was Black Panther of 2017, which made over $1 billion.
And money is not I think we were all well enough aware that money is not a proxy for quality, but it certainly represents popularity.
But it's also a huge change. That was not, movies
Yes.
that were winning Best Picture were often big time box office draws, if not the biggest box office draw. And it's become more and more divorced. And I think, yeah, Moonlight is a good example of this, where La La Land definitely beat it at the box office. But Moonlight, a movie not many people saw, cleaned up. And it's also the case of Hurt Locker. Hurt Locker is 82nd on that list.
What's the
And
lowest? What's the last?
the one was Coda, which made
Oh, okay. Yeah, but
$2.2
that one's not
million dollars.
that one's not that one's streaming. Yeah. I guess the streaming thing's gonna
It's
throw it off. Yeah.
yeah, it's streaming, and it was streaming in 2021, so it's
Yeah.
it's a really weird situation there where you have COVID and all that. Um, but yeah, Hurt Locker made $72 million, next to Avatar, which did it make 2 billion?
It probably has by now.
Something like that. It made over a billion. It
Oh
was
my
the
God,
number
it's
one.
just awful.
It's pretty bad
That's the
movie.
thing, like that is just a bad movie.
Yeah,
His
yeah.
I love the Fern Gully meets Dances with Wolves. It's my favorite explanation I've ever heard of it. And it's true, and it's bad. Like you had 10 years to write your script, and the best you could come up with was unobtainium. That's the best. You had how many years?
Yeah.
Sorry, I hate that movie.
No, I hate that movie too. But
KJ, do you agree, or are you gonna vote against us on that?
No, I honestly cannot stand the movie.
It's really bad.
but yeah, and I agree. Like, money obviously isn't a proxy for excellence. It probably shouldn't tell us anything about excellence, but it does tell you about what these people think of as excellent. And at one point, a popular audience and these people, this kind of guild, agree. And at a certain point, they stop agreeing. Right?
Well, in 2009, is that a better representation of were we were in the States?
No,
Avatar
maybe.
versus Hurt Locker,
Mhm.
right? So, we were all alive in 2009. This is right after the crash, right?
Mhm.
2008, the crash. Did we need some sci-fi space, on another planet where people were having troubles and, if you just keep at it, you get better? I don't even remember what the moral
Maybe
of
if
this
it
movie
was
is, but-
good. maybe, then maybe we would have needed it.
Yeah, I mean, Hurt Locker is a very bleak movie about a war we were in at the time, right?
And I mean, I guess, this is the, well, how much, I mean, I guess this is part of the question is like, this is the problem with like Hurt Locker in versus Avatar. And, Avatar, again, I don't like it, but sometimes what the more modern Academy Award winners, the Best Picture winners, feel like they are, and this might be explain some of the problems with them, is it feels more like the Academy chiding people, being like, this is the movie you should have been watching. Like they have that feeling to them. So that's why it's like, we are not going to give this to Avatar. Like you should have been watching this movie. This movie had a point. Like it just seems to have that like finger pointing thing. There seems to be there's almost like a judgmental aspect to it. um and whether that's because it's like this had a point, a political point, like and you should have been watching it, or like this was artistic, this was beautiful, you should have been watching this, you shouldn't have been watching La La Land, you should have been watching, which I haven't seen, Moonlight, so I don't know, but like that sort of idea where whether or not that's accurate, I feel like that's a perception that I
Sure.
personally get,
Mhm.
and I think that's a perception other people have, that there's almost this like finger wagging aspect of, you ignored the good movie. Now, plebs, we will show you the good movie. You all spent your time watching
The
Avengers.
Love Parade
Yeah.
instead of All Quiet on the Western
Instead of
Front.
a Wild Card on the Western Front, but again, that's kind of the feeling that it has.
Yeah.
That there's this sort of like, now let us redirect your attention so that you all will know what a good movie is. And does that actually reflect the fact that popular movies are worse now, or does that reflect the fact, and so a good movie does get ignored? Is that the problem, or is it that, and that's, I'm not denying that could be the case, that good movies now don't get the attention that they used to get? Is that the problem? And that's the Academy Award is using its sort of power, whatever word you want to use for it, its authority. I guess authority is probably the better word. It's using its authority to demonstrate what is real quality. I think that's potentially also what's going on here, and that might be what's a little bit going on.
Which is, I mean, there's a few things that come to mind here. First of all, movies are supposed to be, and this is maybe a product of the 1930s, movies are supposed to be the common man's art, right? It's something everyone can afford, rich or poor, which is why movies did very well in the 1930s, despite the fact that no one had any money. And that seems to have been the case for quite a while. And now we're in a period where if the we're in a period where movies can be high art and there can be popular entertainment, right? The most popular movie got Oscar award, and then the best movie Oscar award. It sort of reflects the first Oscars in 1929. There was an Oscar for the best movie, and then there was an Oscar for the most artistic achievement, which is why Wings won best movie, and artistic achievement went to the F.W. Murnau movie Sunlight, right?
Oh, that's such a
Sunrise, excuse me, Sunrise.
Sunrise. Yeah, you know
Yeah,
which one you're talking about. That's
yeah.
We watched that a few years ago,
Yeah,
didn't we?
for
And it's
Talking Pictures
such a
Trivia.
good
Yeah,
movie.
Yep.
yeah.
That's probably, I mean, there might be a better, I mean, it's hard to say like best artistic achievement. That's a bit, it's a
It's a
bit
bit weird.
pedantic. Yeah, yeah, it's
Mhm.
Avatar would have taken that. I mean,
yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. But I mean, there's something a little
Best
pedantic or a little weird about
unique
it.
and artistic picture. That was the official title for
But
that
there is
category.
something to that,
Mhm.
that the not the best movie isn't necessarily the most artistic. It's not necessarily but it's also not necessarily the most popular. So there, if you did trifurcate into most artistic, best, and most
Most
popular,
popular.
there's sort of
Mhm.
a
And
sense
most
in which that's logical, but at the same time, it's also just like you're you're admitting that this might be a bit silly. You're admitting that this whole project is a bit silly to give these awards anyway.
Yeah, yeah.
Um,
Yeah, it's awarding the best art and so awarding the best popular
Most popular makes a bit more
is
sense, but
because
I
you
mean,
can
essentially,
calculate it. Yeah.
yeah, I mean,
Um,
essentially, but I mean, then you might as well be like, what had the most box office sales? Like that's
why not?
what, yeah, but I mean, I
Why?
can look that up on Wikipedia. That's not an award,
Yeah,
you
but
know.
it's now it's like the ESPYS, the ESPN awards, where they like give the ESPN award to the team that won the World Series, and like you were the best baseball team. Here's your
Here's
ESPY.
your award, which you already won
Yeah.
because you won the World Series.
And
So
so something's like the most popular. There is a standard that is too strict to make an award
well,
interesting.
nowadays it might make a bit more sense because nowadays you've got a combination of streaming and box office, and you could make an argument that actually there is something. How many times did one person stream it versus how many times was it streamed versus like you actually could make an argument now that it
Mm-hmm.
has become a lot less quantifiable for most popular.
Mm-hmm.
Now, ironically enough, there could be an argument for it. Um, and there could be some sort of weighting scale or whatever to come up with that number that you can make an argument that makes a little bit more sense now.
Mm-hmm.
But especially something like best artistic achievement, like who should decide who is to decide who is the better artist.
Mm-hmm.
That's pedantic at best.
Yeah, which is why the award I didn't think survived
Yeah.
past 1929. But there's also something with like the blockbuster. We always think of Jaws as the first blockbuster, which sort of ends the 1970s, right? I mean, the 1970s is the sort of era of more auteur type people, and it's the collapse of the studio system. So they just kind of turn it over to Robert Altman and eventually Spielberg and Francis Ford Coppola, and they're like, we don't know what to do with this, so you go do something with it. That's where you get this sort of like high, what we might think of as high art stuff. But then, of course, the best movies of that time often tend to be bestsellers. Like The Godfather was very financially successful, um,
And also a good movie.
and also a good movie, and also an adaptation.
Did not see that one because I just didn't have the time to read Mario.
No, it's not a very good book,
I've
and
heard that. I'm like, I'm not gonna do that one.
yeah,
It's
yeah.
too long.
And
It
who else
was
did?
cool that we picked Ben Hur.
Yeah,
Good
so instead we're
job.
doing Ben Hur. Thank
I
you so
didn't
much.
know. I didn't know how long it was, and I had no idea what it was about.
Yes,
So that's gonna be a fun episode.
it's gonna be a fun episode. But
Have you seen it,
but
KJ? You think you said you've seen it, right?
Yeah, I've seen the Charlton Heston one, and then there's a silent film in
there's an
like
earlier Ben Hur movie,
25.
Oh,
yeah,
we
Yeah.
should totally watch that one when that one comes
yeah.
up, just for fun.
And
It
there's
is.
also a modern one. There's a one made a few years ago.
Yep.
It is insanely long. Like I'm trying
Mm.
to like crank through it. I'm like, man, 19th century books. I don't need that detailed a
Pay
description of a
by the
carpet.
word.
But it's like
Pay
I
The
by
don't
the
need,
long
yeah.
word.
book century.
This carpet does not need this much description.
The
I
long
know
book
what a camel
century.
looks like. I'm good.
But with the what do you call it, the blockbuster with Jaws and then everything after that, it you could make a movie that wasn't the best movie but excited people. It was the most titillating or what have you. And that seems to be this point where you get this kind of divorce between, or this gradual divorce between story and spectacle, right? And if you can merge those things into something, something really exciting. And I think Lord of the Rings, that trilogy is really exciting because it's a merger of great story and spectacle. Right? I mean, so much of Lord of the Rings is just marveling at the technical stuff, and
It is beautiful. I mean,
it's
that's the
beautiful.
only.
Yeah.
I think it's the only movie I've watched like every behind the scenes DVD,
Mhm.
and it's just like fascinating the level of work that
I
went
went
into it.
into
It
it.
is bonkers. It's bonkers.
And that's also, it's an exception for its time because it wins so many Oscars and so many of them are technical, right? It just wins,
I don't
and it
think it
wins
won any.
screenplay.
I don't think it won any acting awards. Not a
I don't think
single
it was,
one.
yeah. Well,
No, Ian McKellen was
McClellan,
nominated. Ian
he
McKellen was
was
nominated
for the
for
first
Fellowship. For
movie, but
Fellowship, he
not
was nominated for
for,
Fellowship, but nothing else.
yeah, not for
So it had
Return.
one nomination for Best Actor and nothing else.
Yeah.
And it's
Everything is technical and storytelling. That's how
yeah.
it's, and director too, I think.
He won Best Director, I'm
I
sure.
think he did, yeah. But that seems to be really an exception that proves the rule, right? Which is it, and I think this is maybe to your point, Pat, why people are still watching that movie and why it also was excellent and it was the best-selling movie of 2003, I think, when it came out, which is you can get story and you can get the thing that made movies the art form of the masses, which is it's a giant demonstration of technical excellence. It's a fireworks show. Movies are a fireworks show that have constantly been getting better. And there is something odd about going, okay, the fireworks, that's for the common man. We're going to talk about
Light
we're
bright.
yeah.
I don't know. Yeah, like, look at how beautiful light bright. Like, look how wonderful it is.
Yeah.
Like, no, I want to watch the fireworks. Like,
Yeah, we are going to watch. We're going to see how this woman works at Amazon and then wanders around the country afterwards, and we're going to reflect on that and the meaning of that, and
is
that
that
could
a
be
movie?
fine. That's Nomadland. Yeah,
Okay, that's I figured. Yeah.
yeah. Which is fine. It's no criticism of that film, but it is also a different direction, and I think really a different philosophical way of philosophical evaluation or aesthetic evaluation of what movies can be and what they can do.
So maybe instead of most popular, you have best and most exciting, or best but boring. And Uzu and Bergman win every year.
Oh God, imagine like best and boring. What is the best movie? Like that has to be 2001: A Space Odyssey, right? Which is just this is
Right?
so
Certainly be
boring.
nominated.
It's so boring, but don't worry, it's good because we tell you it's good. God, I hate that movie.
Actually, you know what? For this season, guys, why don't we come up with our own awards
Yeah.
for each of these movies as the
Yeah, I like
Sure.
that.
audience get excited? We're
That
gonna,
could be our
instead of
opening question.
Doing our,
Yes.
Yeah, instead of doing adaptations, we're doing awards here.
I actually like that. That'll be fun.
See how
That'll
that
be
goes.
fun, yeah.
Can I just tell my story about when I went to go see Avatar? So when I went to go, we went to go see a midnight showing, I think, and it was like there was a theater. The Kaufman Theater was right down the street where I used to live in the city in New York, and it was like mobbed. Like it was just like it was a circus. There were just so many people all around the theater, and they were on like every bar. Like it was weird. You've never see, you see a lot of people in New York City, but not this like sort of mingling circusy kind of feel to it because everyone was going to go see this thing. And so I was tasked with getting the tickets for me and a couple other friends. And I came back to the bar where we were, and I think it was like, okay, I couldn't get tickets to like the 12 o'clock or the 1 o'clock. And I said for the 2 o'clock show, it was sold out too. So I just said, just forget it. Just give me tickets to It's Complicated with Meryl Streep and what's his name?
Steve Martin, I think, and Alec
No,
Baldwin.
Alec Baldwin. Yeah, Alec
I think
Baldwin. So I
Steve
was like,
Martin's in it
so
too.
I
isn't
said,
he?
don't worry. I got us all tickets to that. I was like, so we're all set. I said, we'll just go see that in 2 hours. We'll hang out here and then we'll go see It's Complicated in 2 hours. And there was this friend of mine who was just like, uh, okay, that sounds good. He's like, I don't want to wait here 2 hours to go see It's Complicated in a 2 a.m. showing. Like, why would you do that? And you can see his like brain trying to be like, I need to get out of this now. Like, I'm just kidding. I did get us Avatar, but it is in 2 hours, so we're gonna go see a 2 o'clock show. Avatar in 2 hours.
Oh God, I'd much rather see It's Complicated.
Well, then we also got we got the 3D showing, but we were in the very first row. We were in the front row, which like watching a 3D movie in the front row is the weird. It's like I can't like watch. Everything is out of focus. Like the leaves look like they're falling on me. I can't deal with this.
I didn't see the 3D version. I saw a 2D version.
I don't think I saw the 3D version either. I don't know what I saw. And then I got angry at the movie regardless.
We saw the 3D version when it first came out, and I remember every time the scene changed, I thought, "Wow, this is 3D," and it was so distracting. Wow, this is 3D. Luckily, there wasn't much going on in the movie. So
That's the point of the movie. It's just to see the 3D technology, as far as I could tell.
Wow.
Mm-hmm.
Have you guys seen the sequel?
No.
The Way of Water or whatever it is?
It took them like
it was
what?
just as bad, maybe worse. I don't know. It was all about saving the
see it?
whales. Yeah, yeah. Yep.
If you're a fan of the Academy Awards or want nothing to do with them, join us on this exploration of how adaptations gained public favor and may have fallen from public favor. You can rate and review this show anywhere fine podcasts are available. For those viewing in YouTube land, if you haven't already, please like this video, subscribe to the Talking Studios channel for all our exciting content, and follow us on social media at Talking Studios. Check out other shows by Talking Studios, including Talking Pictures Trivia, where we explore movies through trivia, Keep Making Movies, where we explore micro-budget films, Limited Lexicon, where we play through text-based adventure games, and Get the Point, where we slowly reveal a movie poster and try to guess which movie poster it is. Got a question for us? Call the Talking Studios hotline at 201-467-8679 and leave a message. It may be featured on a future episode. And if you haven't already, please subscribe to Adaptation, wherever fine podcasts are found. Join us next time when we discuss All Quiet on the Western Front, both the book and the 1930 movie.
Wow, Talking Studios.
Next week, we'll be discussing All Quiet on the Western Front. Pat, if you could give All Quiet on the Western Front an award, what award would it be?
I would give it the most likely to be watched by a panicked high school student the night before an exam. Because it's remarkably, it's pretty faithful. The thing is, it's faithful, but it makes a number of changes, which we can discuss them next week. Why I think, and this is, I think, a good discussion of why a film probably needed to make some of those adaptations to make the film actually work. So it does make changes, but it has, you could fake your way through it if you just knew some of the changes. You could fake your way through it a high school exam. I think you could do it. So I would go with that. I think it's very different from the 20th century or the recent one, which is just like radically different and not really the same story at all. So that one, don't watch that if you're a high school student trying to get past the exam. But this one, you could fake it.
If you need to cheat, stay in 1930.
KJ, what about you?
So if I was giving this movie an award, All's Quiet on the Western Front, I think I'd give it the most likely to prevent wars in the future award. My gosh, watching this,
it didn't work.
It didn't work.
I'm just gonna throw that out there. 1930.
There was
a big one coming.
another one.
There was another one coming.
I know, but audience, I would not do well in a war. I really wouldn't. And see, even just watching the movie, we'll get into it next week. But holy moly, I thought this was a pretty rough watch. Audience, it's a really good movie, but there's a lot that happens. Like, I don't know. It was intense. It was intense. How about you, Tom? What award would you give it?
So mine isn't silly. It's actually serious. I didn't realize they did not give an Oscar this year in 1930 to editing. That wasn't a thing. And so
it's a very well edited movie.
It's incredibly edited. And so I was like,
man, yeah.
I was going to give it the Eisenstein Award for editing from the Battleship Potemkin. I'm like, this looks a lot like the editing in the war scenes in that movie. Like it's not edited in the way like Saving Private Ryan is, where you have like a clear narrative. It's edited. It's like these different visual images that are clashing together, especially in that first battle. So I'm going to give it the editing award for
I like
the
that a lot,
first
Tom.
editing Oscar.
You're right. That's a fair one. Yeah.
It isn't funny. It's accurate.
It's funny because it's accurate.
Yes. This is what everybody tells me on a first date. You're not funny, but you're accurate.
Do you ever get you're funny because you're accurate?
No. It's also why I'm not married. But anyway, that's a different show.